All right. Spend a minute to look. Well, let's talk about it. Maybe we'll spend a minute at the high-low application. But the high-low application sort of shows the general form for Razor pages, and that is that we have a .cshtml and a .cshtml.cs. And so there's two files associated with each Razor page. Yes.
Projectors.
Oh, no projector. Thanks. So we have two files associated with the Razor page, the CISS243 and the CISS243. This is sometimes called the page model. And a request comes in, and based on the URL, it gets mapped to the appropriate CISS243 file. And one of two things are going to execute: the onGet, the onPost. When does each get called? An onGet is if you just typed the address of the page in the browser. The onGet would be if you clicked a link. All right. OnPost would be typically you're submitting a form. And the form has a method of post. It could still be an onGet if your form had a method of get. But the way we've seen it is we've taken the default in this form and defaulted to onPost. So there's going to be code in here in this, in either of these two places, at least in one of them, if there's any kind of dynamic content at all. In our case, I don't think we had anything on the onGet in the high-low game. That code is going to fill in attributes that are defined in the page model. When that page is finished, then when the function is finished, this gets called, and this pulls the attributes of the page model that we set. So this is a general formula for all the ones that we're going to be looking at. CISS243 has the logic in it. All right. In other words, the game logic for our high-low game was in the cshtml.cs file, the page model. The display aspect of it is in the CISS243. So let's take a minute to look at this again. And if you remember, when we play it, when the page loads, no processing really happens. So there's really nothing on the onGet. So the page just displays. However, when we make a pick and hit play, this is posting. This is calling the URL and is posting a request. So then the onPost method gets called, and the code goes, fills in all these attributes, and then the CISS243 page displays it. This URL of high-low is what gets mapped to this .cs file that exists in Pages. That's set up, that's just how Razor Pages work. That URL tells which in the Pages file to get. All right, and as I said before, there's code in the onPost, which if we look at the CSS_HTML, the method is defined as post. So when we submit the form, the request is of type post. Notice that there's no onGet, which means that nothing really happens when the page initially loads. But on post here, we have all the logic that does its thing. And that logic fills in these attributes. So we filled in the value of the first dice, the second dice, the string that contains the results, image 2, and all those things. All these get filled in by our code. And if you haven't already, take a minute to look at this this week. But it gets filled in. All right. Our CSS_HTML page then, this is the page model, the cshtml.cs page. The page, the display page, goes and pulls values from the model. That's what this means. @model.balance. That's saying pull from the model the attribute called balance. So that corresponds to this right here, this variable right here. Here we're pulling balance again. Here we're pulling the results, or we're pulling the results class to set the class of the section. Here we're pulling the user's choice. Here we're pulling the image. All those variables got filled in by the code in the onPost. All right. So it's important that you sort of have an understanding of that when a request happens, it's going to the cshtml.cs file. It's either going to execute the onGet or onPost. Those methods, again, depending on the nature of the problem, are going to fill in a set of attributes, and then those attributes are available to be displayed on the page. So that's sort of the recipe for all these. All right. Next week, we're going to do our first example of integrating with the database. But I thought before we did that, I wanted to look at another example, an example that pulls the data from a different place. Or actually, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. I'm going to talk about the implications of this with our database-driven websites. Now we're going to have the same thing. I'll draw them over this side. We're going to have our page model, cshtml.cs. We have our page. Request is going to come in from this. And there's going to be code on the onGet and on the and maybe on the onPost, one of the two probably. That's going to fill in some attributes here. All right, and then those attributes get used by the page. Display the data. That's pretty much the diagram I had before. Now here's the thing. Some of the code in the onGet and onPost has to talk to a database. All right, some of the code has to talk to the database. So how are we going to do that? There's been a number of different attempts to do this, and there's a number of different ways this is done in server-side scripting and even in earlier versions of ASP.NET. What we're going to do in .NET Core is sort of a novel idea, and it's actually pretty good. Right? Here we have the database here. we're going to have a set of classes built within our project that map to the database. What do I mean by map to the database? It means they correspond with each other. They're in sync. All right. If there is a customer class, that's going to map to a customer table in the database. Customer class is going to correspond to a customer table in the database. And all the relationships are also captured various different ways. I'm not going to talk about relationships right now between tables. We'll just talk very simple for accessing just one table. All right. So we have a customer class that corresponds to this. Now, as you can probably imagine, the key to this is these two have to be in sync. They have to match up. So for example, if in the customer class there was a customer ID, name, email address, and in the database table there was a customer ID, name, email address, and phone number, there's going to be a problem, right? Because those two don't match up. They don't have the same number of fields in them. So they have to have the same number of fields, they have to be the same data type, and they have to correspond with each other. Well, anyone that's done anything in life knows that it's hard to keep two things on the same page together synchronized. All right. So there's actually two approaches that are done with ASP.NET Core. And one of them is to define the database. Then we're going to generate classes. I think we can see where this one's going. The other approach is to define the classes and generate the database. Let's think for a second why you might choose one versus the other. You don't have to answer out loud if you don't want to, but why might we choose to define the database first? This approach of having the database and generating the classes. Well, we might want to do that if the database is already defined. Let's say we have our catalog in a database and we decide to put it online. All right. We have all those tables and we have all the value in the database and so on. We just need an ASP.NET Razor page that is going to access it and allow us to view it and allow our customers to view it and search it and so on. So if we already got our database, then it makes sense to use the database first method. That's what this one's called, database first, because we define the database and then we generate the classes. This is often called code first, where we define in our code the customer classes. And then we generate the database from it. You probably could make arguments either way. I generally prefer the define classes first approach. So we're going to define code first, and then we are going to generate our database from it. And it's important because if you update the classes, you need to update the database to keep it in sync. So if you add, for example, if you have a customer table that, let's say it starts out in sync, all of them have a customer ID, name, email address, and phone number, and you add an address, city, state, and zip. Well, if you do that, you would do that if you're using the code first in code classes here, and then you would issue an update to update the database to bring it back into sync. This process, by the way, is pretty smart. Now we'll see examples of just how smart it is. But For example, if you have a field in there, if you have an integer called customer ID, it's smart enough to know that that's probably the primary key of the table. Primary key of the table. Later on, when we define relationships, it's smart enough to make an intersecting table to implement a many-to-many relationship, or to make a foreign key if it's a one-to-many relationship. So this process of taking the code and defining the classes is actually pretty smart. All right, it does a real good job on it. Not to say that you won't run into issues, all right, but you know, hey, there's issues with everything. All right. If I drop dead at the end of the lecture, is because this Power C was poisoned, because this is the nastiest tasting stuff I've ever tasted. It's normally pretty good, but it tastes like it is old. So I don't know, is there an expiration date on this? Let's see one. Anyhow, this is gross. I'm not going to drink it. All right. Now, we're going to view an example today. And we're going to view an example that doesn't access a database. So it's going to be a little different than the examples we're going to get into. But it's the same idea. In this case, we're not accessing a database. We're accessing a content management system. So it's very similar, but the mechanism of how it's done is slightly different. All right. What's a content management system? Well, again, if you think about, a site that has products, there's ways to add new products, to manage the content on your site. So you could put in new products and that will get added to the database and that will show and that will be reflected on the web pages. So it manages the content. Any of you that have used Blogger, I know some of you are in the multimedia class. I don't know how many of you, but that would be a content management system, right? Because you're not writing a brand new web page for every blog entry you post. You're typing it in and posting that entry, and it's taking your content, your article that you've written in Blogger, and making a web page out of it. Well, we are going to integrate to content management system called content management system, content.ai, I believe it's called. A lot of the principles are the same. So we're not going to spend too much time on this, but I do want to introduce you because this is a good way to show this principle in action of how the CS file fills in some data attributes, and those are used by the CSS_HTML file. Now, in this particular approach, they used essentially defining the database and generating the classes. So let's take a look at this application. And we'll see what I mean. This is meant to be an application for a coffee manufacturer or coffee roaster or something like that. If we run it, we get to the home page, and we see some things. This is the home page. No URL, so the assumption is that we're going to, in the root directory of pages, we're going to index.cshtml. So in other words, there's no URL. By default, we go into the pages root folder and pull up Oh, they must have done something with the mapping because this is actually what we're pulling up. We're pulling up in the home folder. Most of the ones we work on, the index will be right in that home directory. Anyhow, these are all articles from the content management system. And they get placed on the page. I don't have access to the content management system, but I could go in, if I did, I could go in and add a new story here about maybe a new kind of coffee that we've created or something like that, or we're having a sale on coffee beans or whatever. I could go in and add it to the content management system, and that would automatically update the pages. Because the data isn't in a static HTML page, it's being pulled from the content management system. All these are, if we look at About Us, coffees, articles, and so on. All these are data being pulled from the content management system and being displayed. Now, think about it here for a second. One of the advantages of a content management system is that you don't have to be a web developer, or you don't have to be an expert web developer to manage the content management system. For example, you take, let's go back to Blogger. Again, very simple content management system. Facebook is a content management system, right? You add a new post, you didn't go in and code HTML for it, right? You go in and add a post and it shows up on people's timelines. All right. Now, both Blogger and Facebook, you don't have to be a development expert. You know, if you know some HTML in Blogger, you can do some cool things. You can do some different things than a non-developer could do. But you don't really need to do that. And the same thing here. So instead of having to have an expensive web developer go in and make these changes to the web pages, you just have someone with just a basic knowledge of the content management system go and make these changes and add to the database that way, and the results appear on the web page. One reason I wanted to show you this too is to show you how creative they got with the way this page looks. All right, we're going to go over our first example next week, and it's going to be very much a kind of very basic, straightforward layout. But here's a case of something where they've taken the basic idea and by doing some work with the CSS_HTML file, made the layout look very good instead of just a list of news stories. So when you're developing this, especially when you look at your semester project, think of how you can think out of the box and go beyond just the simple defaults that scaffolding, we'll talk about scaffolding next week, the scaffolding does for you. Because scaffolding generates pages for you, and they fit a very standard look and feel, and they work and all that, but they're not terribly exciting. But by changing the CSS_HTML file, you can get any kind of look you want. All right. Now, the details of how this is accessed, we're not going to necessarily spend a lot of time on because this is a content management system. And again, we're not doing that. But the basic idea of having the page model pull data from somewhere, all right, populate some objects, some attributes in the model, and then the page itself pulling these attributes is going to be a common theme that we're going to do. Let's look at the articles page. Oh, we are looking at it already. /articles, again, maps to, in the articles folder, index.cshtml. So when we call articles, that's what we get. The URL has articles. So let's look at that. Stop debugging. might have been the one I wanted. Sure. I'm going to open up index.cshtml and its appropriate page model. There's the index. There's the page model. Now, this line here is going to be a list of articles. You know, it says list. It's going to be a list of articles from the content management system. This line of code actually fills in this list from the content management system. We'll have code similar to this, but not exactly like this. So don't worry about memorizing the details of this. We'll see our own examples. But the idea is we have this attribute, which is a list of articles. All right. It's a list composed of individual articles, and it gets filled in on the onGet method. And there's no onPost because we're never posting a form to this. So this one only has code on the onGet. Now, what is in this articles class? That's going to be in our models folder. And if we look, we'll see that there's article generated. All right. This is code that got generated by the content.ai content management system. So it creates for us a class that represents an article. And it's all these attributes about it. Post date, related articles, sitemap, a summary of the article, image, the title, and so on. All these are attributes in that class. So this class represents these things over here. The classes that our code is going to be using to access. In our case, it will be the database. In this case, it will be the content management system. Now, notice at top it says that this code was generated. Well, why is it generated? Well, like I said, it has to be in sync. So you start with one, you generate the other, and that makes sure that they always match up. So let's look at the index CSHTML. Essentially, all it does is it fills this list of articles. Is everyone aware of this syntax? This is defining a list. If we're going to read this, this is defining a certain kind of list. And what kind of list, the specifics isn't important, but it's defining a list of articles. That's what this means. Each item in this list is going to be one of these article objects. So we have a list, or sometimes called a collection, of articles. Go to another page. Look at coffees. We have a list of coffees. Okay, a list of coffee objects. So we're going to have a list of certain kinds of objects. We're going to populate that list some way. Again, our code's going to look similar but different than this. But we're going to pull the data from our database. Now, what's the index CSHTML look like? Well, it's pulling stuff from the model. So for each article, the way to read this, for each article, in the models article list items, so in the list of articles from the model. We're going to loop through. Each time through, we're going to call that variable article. And then we pull the article post date, the article title, the article summary. We're pulling those 3 fields. Well, a couple others. There's an image too. There's a link to the detail. So again, what I want you to remember here is just a few things. Don't get caught up in the details of this, but just conceptually remember that. We got a list of things here. In this case, it's articles. We have our onGet and or onSync. In this case, we only have an onGet. It's going to populate that attribute. It's going to populate that list. And then we're going to have our page itself pull items from that list. And it's going to do it for every article that is in the list of articles that was retrieved from the database. Now there's some cool code to give us, there's some cool code and some cool style sheet stuff to give us the look of putting them side by side. This is again using Bootstrap, which we talked about, I think we talked about in one of the other classes. And the nice thing about this is it is already optimized for mobile websites. So this is how it would appear on like a desktop device. If I had a smaller window, we'd get 2 side by side. And if we had a very small, like phone device or something, we get a single column. That's pretty good. This is mobile ready, this web page. All right, let's look at the detail, because if you click on one of these links, it takes you to a page that shows all of the information from the article. Remember, this page only showed the summary. This page shows the full detail. So let's look at the detail page. Let's see if we can follow the same pattern that we had, where we have our page model, which fills in some attributes, and then we have our page itself, which fills in, which grabs what that we filled in and displays it. So in our detail page, we don't have a list of coffee objects. We have a single coffee object. All right, that's what that means. We don't have a list of coffee objects. We have just a single of coffee objects. We retrieve the data from content management system. In this case, though, we're doing it a slightly different way because we're only getting one item back. We're actually grabbing the first item out of the list that response gets. But if the content management system, if everything is okay with that, we should only get one item. But this pulls the first element that gets responded from this. So we have our coffee object. Then if we look at the detail page, we'll have in here pulling different things from the detail page. Oh, I'm on coffees. I meant to be on articles. Same idea. Pulls all the items from the model coffee variable, pulls the farm that is from, information about the variety, And if there's any processing instructions, it pulls those processing instructions. I'm going to scare you with this example because this is a pretty big example. But I want to give in context before we get into this, sort of an overview of how these Razor pages work. All right, your assignment next week, and I'll go over this in class, but you're welcome to give a try to it beforehand. Let me pull up the assignment for next week. What we'll be doing in class next week is going through this tutorial. And your assignment will be to go through this tutorial and go through and add something to the tutorial. So you're not just doing the tutorial, you're doing the tutorial and then you're adding a second thing in it. And what this does is this walks you through the process of creating a web page. You create the application. You create your model, because we're doing a code first example. Here's our model for movie. We do what's called scaffold the model for CRUD operations. CRUD, C-R-U-D, stands for create, retrieve, update, and delete functionality. So we're going to get some very basic rudimentary pages. And then we're going to update the database. You see the instructions to do that somewhere. Right here. As I said, you got to keep the database in sync with your models, with your classes. And that's what this migration, add migration, and update database does. Now, special word to the Mac users in here. If you're running a Mac, you have two choices, right? Choice number one, and I can help you through this, I can help you through this. Number one, if you're running Parallels. Parallels is a program that allows you to run Windows applications on a Mac. So if you're running Parallels, you can install, on the Windows side of things, you can install Visual Studio. You are going to have a problem with, you're likely to have a problem with Microsoft SQL Server. That is the database engine that we're connecting to. You actually have to end up downloading the 2014 version of SQL Server, and that will work for you just fine. And I can help you through that if you're having any problems. All right. The Mac side does have problems from time to time, and we discovered some new ones last semester, and we might discover some new ones this semester for all I know. All right, but that would be option one. If you are running Parallels, you can install it on the Windows side, and you're going to have to update your, you're going to have to uninstall SQL Server and install SQL Server 2014. If you don't have Parallels and you're going to run it on the Mac side, watch this video, Visual Studio's on Mac video, and read this article, Migrations on the Mac. Issuing the commands to synchronize your database is a little more involved if you're running it on the Mac. It's just not quite as convenient as running it on the Windows version of it. But you can do it. You will not be, if you run it on the Mac and not in Windows on Parallels. If you run it on the Mac, you will not be creating SQL Server databases. You'll be creating SQLite databases. But other than that, the concept will be the same. You'll have a problem if you download any of the examples that are done with Windows because you won't have the SQL Server, and I can walk you through what you need to do to correct that. All right, you just need to change the database connection in one of the control files, and you'll be able to do the same thing except with a SQLite database. So there's a little more involved if you're running it on a Mac. If you're running it on a PC, shouldn't be any problems. You don't need to do these things. That's where the demonstration class will be. But anyhow, I will go through this tutorial next week in class, and then your assignment is to duplicate that. And this actually creates a movie table. Your assignment requires you to create a movie table and to create a second table, an actors table. But we'll talk about that next week. If you want to get a head start on it, feel free to run through the tutorial. Feel free to play with the application that I demoed in class today. Are there any questions? Yeah.
I know, sorry, to manage some SQL, there's PHP in my head.
Yes.
Does that work at all?
Would that work? Can it connect to a SQLite database?
I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, if you could connect it to a MySQL database or a SQLite database, then yeah, then you should be able to use it.
That work for SQL Server?
I don't know. My guess is that it doesn't, because the PHP stuff is sort of the non-Microsoft technology. So usually it would be geared towards MySQL and other non-Microsoft, but that's just my guess. Any other questions? All right, we'll either see you up in lab or we will see you next week.